Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is about connections and history and what history gets preserved and who gets to tell the story. I wanted to share a couple of threads that I learned about independently that reminded me of each other. And so I wanted to talk about that today because I find it really interesting. Particularly since we're living through such historic times, let's say. But before getting into the content of today, wanted to remind people that I do have a new Substack, and I welcome people to come check it out and to follow and to read and to let me know what you think. It's called Wellness to Abolition. I've actually renamed it to make it more focused on what I will actually be writing about. And all of this is connected to the book that I'm working on, Get Well, which is about the connections between the wellness industry and prison abolition and my beliefs around the old saying of hurt people, and therefore what would it look like if we all had access to healing, and if everyone was well, we wouldn't need or we wouldn't rely on these institutions of cruelty and that perpetuate unwellness, which then just leads to more unwellness and more hurt. And so, I explore the various ways in which the prison system perpetuates the very harms that we are told that the prison system stops, and what it means to be well, and how the prevalence of wellness culture and the wellness industry, how that could actually be leveraged to create change on a societal level rather than it being just about, individual wellness and individual self-care. Anyway, so I want to let people know I have a Substack. It's called Wellness to Abolition, and I hope you'll check it out. All right, moving on to today's episode. So what initially prompted this episode is that I was listening to an article from a podcast called The Guardian Long Read, which I highly recommend. As the name implies, this is a podcast produced by The Guardian where they do audio versions of some of their longer pieces. It's very well done. They cover a huge range of topics, and so I highly recommend the podcast, The Guardian Long Read. And what prompted this episode was an episode from that podcast from April 2nd, so recently, that is entitled Apocalypse No, How Almost Everything We Thought We Knew About the Maya is Wrong. And the episode talks about how there had long been this Western assumption about the limited nature of Mayan civilization, and that there has been more recent scholarship making clear that Mayan civilization was much larger, lasted for much longer, and was far more complex than previously discussed in Western texts, and actually encompass up to 16 million people, stretching from the areas that are modern day Mexico to Belize and Guatemala, and doing this just very, very fascinating analysis of the various reasons why Mayan accomplishments, culture, developments have been misconstrued, and then what we have learned, and comparing how we talk about Mayan civilization in comparison to other in comparison to other, major civilizations that we learn about in history, like the Roman Empire. Anyway, one of the things they talk about in the episode is that the actual name Maya, like the Mayan people, was actually the name that the Spanish gave to the indigenous people of those areas. It's not that Mayan didn't exist, but it was just one of many, many tribes, and therefore many languages, cultures, and names that the indigenous people had for themselves. But the Spanish imposed that name basically to describe everybody. And it was that thread that reminded me of two other things that I had learned about recently, specifically about indigenous people in New Zealand and indigenous people in Brazil, and how colonial forces created basically a monoculture of indigenous people and what the effects of that are to this day. And so I wanted to just walk through those different examples, and I find it disturbing, but also so fascinating, right? The ways that history repeats itself and the patterns that we can see, and what we can learn, what we can learn from that, how we can do better now that we know better. So anyway, going to this first example in terms of Mayan culture throughout the Americas during the time of Spanish colonization, I wanted to share a direct quote from this article that talks about this phenomenon. So, quote, "Outsiders' power over the story of the Maya is written into the people's very name. After their arrival in the early 1500s, the Spanish named local populations Maya, after the ruined city of Mayaban in present-day Mexico. Yet the Maya never saw themselves as one people and were never governed under one empire." Close quote. The indigenous people of this area had many different languages. They were of various tribes with different traditions, and yet the Spanish came and just called them all Maya and created this, again, kind of like indigenous monoculture. And so much of, and one of the consequences of that imposition of a single narrative was that so much of the knowledge of that time has been lost. And one of the interesting things that the article talked about as well in terms of the consequences of this is that there have even been conspiracy theories that, the various temples that the Maya built, you may have visited some of them. There's, there's phenomenal, incredible temples. Throughout the I would say the northern part of what is now Latin America. I've been to Chichen Itza, for example, which is in Mexico. There are many of these sites where just like these incredible temples and pyramids and various structures from that era. Anyway, the article was talking about how there's these various conspiracy theories that like still linger, that people say that it was aliens that built these things rather than people. And the article talks about like why. I mean, why would you indulge in such conspiracy theories rather than accepting that there was this extremely advanced society many centuries ago that was thriving perfectly fine without the contact of Western colonialists. And they quote a Guatemalan archaeologist and Mayan expert, Livy Gracioso, who puts this beautifully as to why these, rather, we could even say racist theories, still have holding power. And she says, quote, "If we deprive the actual Maya of their glorious past, we don't need to give them power today," close quote. And it makes sense, right? If you are able to discredit the accomplishments of that culture, of that society, of those peoples, then it's much easier to justify their mistreatment. And the Spanish, in terms of their treatment of the indigenous people in the Americas, parallels the treatment by colonialists in other parts of the world, right? Killing off many of them simply by exposure to diseases, but then also through enslavement, other forms of violence, widespread rape, and exploitation of local populations. And to this day, the Mayan people, again, who are categorized under this mono name, this, mono indigenous moniker, rather than in recognition of the various tribes and various, subgroups and diversity within the indigenous community, to this day, they remain quite stigmatized, quite marginalized among the poorest people in their countries, again, largely concentrated in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala. And so they have terrible outcomes in terms of all, health and socioeconomic indicators today. And that stems broadly from colonialism. But one of the components of that is the colonial story that was told about who the indigenous people were, and labeling them as Maya, and without recognizing the complexity and diversity within indigenous cultures. And we see the ripple effects of that to this day, centuries later. And so I heard that episode, and then it reminded me, as I said, of a couple of other parallels that I had also learned about relatively recently. So, for example, I had the opportunity last year to go to New Zealand, and while I was there, I visited the Waitangi Treaty Grounds, which are in northern New Zealand. I highly recommend, if you ever have the opportunity to go to New Zealand, to visit the Waitangi Treaty Grounds. It is a whole complex. There is a museum, but the museum is basically like this whole complex. It's just this land that has various buildings on it. And those, as the name implies, this was the land where the treaty that basically created, in quotes, New Zealand as a British colony was signed. And that treaty was signed in 1840 between British representatives and the Maori people. And it's kind of interesting. There's another, not really the topic of today's episode, but as a tangent, because it's related to current events, there was controversy from the very beginning about that treaty, because there were different versions of the treaty, the English version versus the Maori version. Probably to nobody's surprise, the difference in the versions was to the Maori's disadvantage. And I bring that up only because it's currently a current topic for global affairs, apparently different understandings and different versions of a very not aptly named ceasefire agreement. Without getting into that too much, going back to the Waitangi Treaty Grounds. So again, New Zealand is home to many indigenous people. The Maori, as we know them today, come from various Polynesian groups who came to what is now modern day New Zealand somewhere around like 1320 to 1350. So long before colonial contact, and very similar to the experience of the Maya, the indigenous people of the Americas, upon the contact with the Spanish. When the British arrived in New Zealand, they did a similar thing of basically labeling everybody as Maori, even though there were many, many different tribes and various, cultures and languages like within that. And Maori actually, in the Maori language, just means normal or natural or ordinary. And the term was used to distinguish, us like mortal human beings from spirits or deities. So it's a general term, but the British used that then to encompass many tribes and many people and many different peoples. And and so once again, you have this imposition of like a monoculture onto a quite diverse group of indigenous people by outside forces. And to this day, just like the Maya in those parts of the Americas, in New Zealand, like Maori is like the term, like it is the recognized term to be like an indigenous person of New Zealand. And just like the Maya, the Maori of New Zealand, across basically all socioeconomic and like health indicators, fare the worst in New Zealand society. When I was at the Waitangi Treaty Grounds, had this fantastic tour guide, Cece. So again, if you ever get to go, recommend. I don't know if she'll still be working there, but she was great. And she talked about how, one of the indicators of just how poorly the Maori are faring still in modern times in New Zealand is that there have been efforts to lower the age to collect Social Security because so many Maori aren't even living long enough to claim it because their life expectancy is less than those of New Zealanders of European descent. They have poor outcomes across the board in terms of education, in terms of overrepresentation in prison, and various other indicators, and very similar to what we saw in the United States and Canada and other places. The treatment, which to be fair, were also British colonies. The treatment of the indigenous people followed the same route of like prohibiting them from speaking their language, basically kidnapping children from their families to put them into these like re-education schools to basically kill off indigenous culture. There's actually a movie I watched about this. It's fictional, but, based on a true historical context called Cousins that tells the story about three Maori cousins living in modern times, but the impact of these types of policies throughout the 20th century. So the movie is called Cousins. Highly recommend it. So again, we have this pattern of I believe that there is a connection, not just, we see that there is a connection between, by and large, whenever like colonial forces came into contact with indigenous people, like it ended badly. They killed a bunch of them off through disease, enslavement, and other horrific practices. They employed a lot of the same tactics. But what these examples also tell me is that part of that narrative as well about diminishing, demoralizing, and disappearing indigenous culture is also in how they're even referred to, and even in their name, in the simplification of what they're even called, and imposing an outside name rather than allowing people to self-identify with whatever name really represented their tribe, in their culture. And then the third example, so we talked about the Maya, we've talked about the Maori. The third example that I was thinking about and learning about recently is the Tupi in Brazil. So the Tupi are probably the largest. I actually don't know today if they are the largest, but at the time of Portuguese colonization, they were the largest indigenous group in the land that is now today Brazil. But the Tupi are one of many, many indigenous groups that existed and still exist in Brazil. And what got me thinking about this is a different podcast I also recommend called Singing for Survival, Capoeira History, a podcast by a friend of mine named Mike Pinto that, as the name implies, is all about stuff related to capoeira. But in one of his recent episodes, he was talking about indigenous influences on capoeira. And so that got me thinking about the connection between the Tupi and the Portuguese, and then these other threads that I had recently thought about. Anyway, so very similar to how the Spanish interacted with the Maya and the British interacted with the Maori in Brazil, how the Portuguese interacted with the Tupi, or the indigenous people. Once again, like, the Tupi were one of many tribes, many cultures, many languages. And even among the Tupi, they were not a single tribe. There were many groups that shared a similar language and culture. And to be fair, they had the largest numbers at the time of Portuguese contact, and they were the ones that had the most direct contact with the Portuguese. But once again, the Portuguese just kind of broadly referred to everybody as the Tupi. And same thing happened, killed a lot of them with disease, with enslavement. There was a massive practice of, Portuguese men making deals to basically take on indigenous wives, to create this like whole subclass of mixed race people that then were employed I'm putting in air quotes here, employed by the Portuguese to perform the hard labor that created, the Portuguese Empire in Brazil. And, to this day, not only the Tupi, but all of the indigenous people of Brazil, like the Mayans, like the Maori, have, terrible outcomes. They are among the poorest, and they have like the worst health outcomes. And in Brazil, I know a little bit more about this. I'm guessing this may also be the case for the Mayan and the Maori. I just can't speak to it as much because I'm not as knowledgeable. But in Brazil, the indigenous people are also constantly having to fight encroachment on their land. Both like efforts, quote unquote, legal efforts from the government, but also like lots of like illegal efforts to come and seize their land, to turn that land into, agricultural, space rather than land that is indigenous land. And, so it got me thinking again about these parallels between, you have colonial forces coming in and taking very diverse, very broad indigenous cultures and imposing this, moniker, one name, one culture, monoculture onto these societies. And there's parallels to other aspects of colonialism, right? Like the monocrop, and the monoculture, the monocrop. And it's like almost literally what we see in Brazil as well, of trying to get rid of indigenous people and steal their land in order to do monocrop agriculture. And we know enough these days that like that type of, single crop, single culture for the land is like really bad. It strips the land very quickly of nutrients. And really what you need is like rotating crops. That is really what is healthiest for the land and sustainability. Modern agriculture has, made lots of adaptations to allow for monocrops to really be like the dominant practice these days. And I'm sure I'm not fully representing this correctly, but there is this parallel, right, between the various types of practices of colonial practice to shrink everything down into one, to simplify everything at enormous cost to both people and land. And because of that shrinking and that oversimplification, right, as we talked about the Mayan example, it just, quote unquote, justifies the stigmatization, the marginalization, the erasure of these people and their accomplishments and their language and their contributions. And we're seeing a little bit of resurgence today, not only in just indigenous sovereignty and language and things like that, but also the understanding that to combat global warming, we really need to be reinvesting in indigenous practices because they were good stewards of the land. Anyway, and so we have and I know there are more examples. These are just a few that came to mind recently in completely different settings that like pulled this common thread together for me. And it made me think of, what's the broadest example or the most common example we know of this like colonial imposition of a name for all indigenous people as an excuse then to treat them as quote unquote barbarians and less than, and impose violence and disease and enslavement and, and other types of violence against these groups. I mean, that's the entire concept of like quote unquote Indians, right? You have Christopher Columbus, this like dumb guy who got a ton of money from the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. And he came out thinking he was going to India, but he didn't get to India. He didn't even get to the United States. He like never actually stepped on like the US soil. But somehow, centuries later, this man still has so much saying power that his term, calling indigenous people Indians, because again, he thought he was going to India, and so the people he interacted with in the Caribbean, because that's where he got to, he called them Indians. And to this day, like that is still, it's still a name that is used, less so, right? People are, understanding that that's like not an accurate term, and we should be calling people indigenous or, Native whatever, Native Americans or, whatever. But it's still very much like a thing. And that comes from like absolute inaccurate, like colonial fallacy, and the imposition of a mono name, monoculture, Indian, onto vast swaths of land encompassing various cultures, languages, tribes, and identities. And therefore, like what that then has been used, right? The Indian label, I can speak most, to the United States. It's the example I'm most familiar with, right? That Indian label has been used as an excuse to condemn, persecute, and erase indigenous culture. The Indians of the United States, to this day, like the Mayans, like the Maori, like the Tupi in Brazil, have like the worst outcomes. They have been basically shuffled onto these patches of land that the U.S. has like allowed them to live on, have the worst like health indicators and socioeconomic outcomes. And that is inseparable from not only all the policies and practices, but also the importance of language and how the dominating force, the colonial force, referred to them, and how that is still, centuries later, still dominant framing, and how that framing therefore justifies their treatment, the poor treatment. And, these are the examples that I'll focus on today, but I think that is a very common thread that is still extremely present in modern times, right? How people are referred to. I mean, any oppressive regime, what do? They use language to demonize, to oversimplify, to analogize with animals or vermin or, something else that is considered undesirable, or that they can parallel with some concept of barbarianism or, being simple, or being not like us, to justify then all kinds of horrific practices, from, discrimination, in jobs, in schools and things like that, to genocide and everything in between. And so it's still a practice that is used to this day. And so it's just interesting. I was just reflecting on that, like the use of language and the use of language to oversimplify and impose one concept, and how that then justifies so many negative outcomes from that. And I understand the human psychology that we like to simplify things, right? We like to put things in boxes and categorize things. It comes from this like survival mechanism, right? We want to understand if someone is a friend or foe. We want to be able to categorize people. But there are massive consequences of doing that as well. And we have seen this happen over and over and over and over again. It is a pattern. And so what can we learn from that? And what can we do to change that so we don't keep repeating that? And what efforts can we make to repair, the harm that has been done? Because, it's not only bad, like it's just like the moral thing, but also we live in such a interconnected world these days that I think recent events have underscored even more, right? We live in a global economy. We live in a global world. And there is a need for recognizing the humanity of all people. And that where there is demonization of cultures and people, history tells us the outcome isn't good, right? Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Just thought that was just really interesting, these like threads that came together and this like repetition in history, and how, again, centuries later, we still see the effects of these practices on the people, on the land, and on our overall well-being as citizens of this world. So with that, I'll close. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.